I go to close the door, and she's literally sitting in the doorway on the
Oh
other
yeah,
side of
I'm not surprised at all.
it.
Seriously, it's like, yeah, it's just I always find them taking advantage of the situation, so I'm used to it.
That's hilarious. They are, aren't they? They're like little opportunists.
Oh yeah, totally, totally.
Yeah. Well, it really teaches you a lot about yourself when you have kids, I think.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
I mean, the things that they pull on you at such an early age, and you're like, wait, how are you manipulating me in this way? And you're only like 6 years old. I don't understand.
Yeah, it is scary.
They just pick it up naturally. It seems they're like little imitators.
Well, yeah, yeah. I mean, I start seeing like, certain qualities in my kids and I'm like, "Oh man, really?" Like it's either that or I just go, genetics might be far, like far more complex than we could ever have imagined. Maybe epigenetically they're picking up all of our, personalities generation after generation or something. I don't know.
Well, that would make me feel a lot better because then it would mean that I'm not inadvertently
Yes.
teaching them this crap.
No, I'm serious though. Like as far as I'm concerned, no, I think that it's more complex than probably we might understand it at this point. But I mean, all I can say is like when I see my, I have 19, 17, 14, and they exhibited qualities far beyond like cultural conditioning, things like that. So I'm
Like,
convinced that it's more than just me.
oh yeah. Well, I mean, like you said, they almost come out with their personalities already sort of intact to some extent.
Oh yeah, it's weird, man. It's crazy. All I can say is it's very weird.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're showing more and more now. I think the research is pointing to what you're saying, which is that a lot more of it is genetics than we think. For instance, like phobias apparently are passed down through the genes.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised because, I'd say like Nick shows way more like, I'd say even borderline panicky and just might even exhibit some of the things that I have. And it's kind of weird because each kid has like, various issues, but that phobia was already manifest like really early on.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, nobody teaches them to be afraid of spiders or to be, afraid of this or that. It just kind of they just
Right.
have it already. It seems.
Yeah, I think so.
So this is actually a good bridge to what I want to talk to you about, which
All
you
right.
already brought up, which is sort of the anxiety side of things. Because we've talked a lot about this, and you said that you're comfortable sharing. So you've been dealing with anxiety for how long approximately?
I would say I'd say the first panic attack. I remember explicitly, probably around, I want to say 9 years old.
Oh wow! So it's something that's been in your part of your life for most of it, basically.
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure. I'd say like, I remember, just having really shaky bowels and just abnormal shakiness and nervousness and anxiety around, getting to a soccer game. And it wasn't even so much like, fears. It was just excitability, but just abnormal excitability.
Yeah. So whereas fear would be like there was something specific about the soccer game, for instance, that was making you afraid. This wasn't it. You were just like you said.
Stoked. Yeah, I
Yeah.
was excited to get there.
Yeah. Interesting. And so when did it become like because that sounds like a healthy sort of
Right.
the healthy function of anxiety, which is to get you alert before a big game or whatever. When did it become something that it was less manageable for you?
That's a good question. I think I became more aware of it. I think at 9, just based on at certain questions that followed with like panic responses. So I'm not even clear why there would be anxiety attacks or even panic responses to the things I was thinking. I mean, some of the thoughts were, infinite regresses at 9 years old, or what if nothing existed, or what is nothing, or just stuff like that.
Holy crap, dude! You were like
Yeah,
trying to solve koans.
yeah, exactly.
Don't tell Jenny though.
No, no,
Yeah,
funny.
so you had like a sort of an inquisitive mind, and that somewhat contributed to your anxiety, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I would say also I think I learned a lot of it from my mom. I mean, she would pace at night, very, very concerned, just like I would say abnormal fears and concerns, so she was highly overprotective, probably double the time that most parents would be. I mean, just very, I think it stems from just a lot of things she had to, experience when she was younger. And so I've come to appreciate it and just feel a lot more, empathy over it, just because, I know she went through a lot. And so watching her, the way she would pace, the way she parented, that kind of stuff, I think I learned some of that from her. So, yeah.
So you were saying the stuff that she went through, like obviously now we're getting even further back out of your life and into your mom's life, but
Yeah,
like,
right.
well, what are some examples? Just generally speaking, you don't have to get into too many details, but like, what are some of the things that would have made her a more anxious person later on in life?
Oh, well, unfortunately, her mom died when she was 16. I mean, she had no, I mean, her father had, ran out early on. So not only was it being raised without a father, having a father run out on you, but then, her mother died of cancer at 16. So, you can understand how frightening that would be. She took care of her mother, 16 years old, taking care of a dying parent is really, I think a bit challenging for anybody. But, there was sexual abuse, outside of the family, more than once too. That's what's peculiar. So, I think her hypervigilance and worries, you can understand at least where she's coming from. And I think passing that on, to your children, it's like the world is not safe. At every corner, there's something, bad that's going to occur. So I think the pattern was already set. If it wasn't, nurture, or, if it wasn't nature, then it certainly was nurtured as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it sounds like it. I mean, and yeah, losing your parent, your only parent at this point at 16 is definitely enough to do it right there, let alone
Yeah,
anything else.
for sure. Yeah.
And of course, now you're afraid of losing your loved ones because they can be taken from you so suddenly. You've seen it firsthand. So, your kids, you're going to hover, you're going to be sort of a
Yeah.
helicopter parent, and you're going to be very protective.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it is interesting. It even goes so far as she incessantly bites her lip, frequently. Now, I don't know if I had learned that from her, but I mean, it's an unbreakable habit. I mean, it's really it's amazing to me that it's not something that I can even stop, no matter how much I try. It's like somebody biting their nails. There's been no solution that's ever helped me stop. Because I think it's typically coming from an incessant worrying mind. It won't stop, and so there's physical manifestations. If it's not shaky bowels, it could be biting the inside of your mouth. It could be a variety of different, I think, physical symptoms that follow.
Absolutely. Yeah, and the fact that so you bite your lip, is you picked that up from your mother, you think?
Yeah, I mean, when she's more nervous, I do notice it quite a bit. I mean, for me, it's just, I mean, sadly, it goes one step further. It's not just biting the inside of my mouth. I end up like chewing off parts of my mouth, and without even understanding or being aware of it, just because the hypervigilance, the anxiety, that feeling again is just manifested with a physical habit. And it's amazing that no matter how much, even the times that I say, hey, just stop it, or my wife will point it out, or one of my kids, it just won't stop. I literally will just go back to it within probably 30 seconds, because once my mind drifts, then I'm not consciously trying to control it, and it just goes right back to it. So
Wow.
yeah, so I would just say these are real clear, like, physical symptoms that come about as a result of that incessant worry, that hypervigilance, etc. So, so I would just say, 9 years old, asking some pretty existential questions. I think moving forward from there, it just became sort of second nature. I was highly inquisitive, but I also was hypervigilant, always aware of, like, body language in other people, being aware of what's going on all around me, and fearing basically that somebody was doing something, or was essentially plotting some kind of, like, nefarious plan. So again, it's not normal, I think, to just I think it's normal to be aware, and I think it's normal to be even vigilant, but I think hyper vigilant is kind of the point I would most indicate as being a little bit different than probably normalcy.
Yeah, well, I mean, as you said, I think vigilance in certain contexts or situations is absolutely normal, and it's a good thing, right? I mean, you got to be
Yeah.
vigilant if you're in Iraq on a tour or whatever, like, you know what I mean? But
Right.
and I think that sort of that biological or hereditary mechanism for that comes from a good place, because when we were, hunter gatherers, we needed to be vigilant, right? I mean,
Right.
our asses depended on it. So, but now I think as life has evolved and as culture has evolved, like I think we were talking about this a little bit yesterday, it seems like a lot of those mechanisms are a little bit obsolete now, because you're rarely in a position where your life depends on you being vigilant and you being aware of your surroundings to the point where you're like, on your tippy toes, like super tense.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I would just say it seems to me just, like we talked about, it just feels like, misfiring. It's like, there's not, there was certainly a role for it, evolutionarily speaking, and it makes sense. And, I've even thought like, hey, I might have been a valuable asset in small bands or, little tribes, because, I see the faces in the forest. I'm up at night freaking out about all the possibilities and potential. So, we're cruising around. You got one guy who's super, let's say he's buff and, bold. He's buff and bold, and he's willing to just grapple with like lions or something. I don't know. For me, it's more, I'm thinking about, 10,000 possibilities. And so, I'd be the guy that would be sharing that with, the chief. He'd be like, kind of like, constantly saying, well, what about this? What about that? What about this? Have you considered this? Have you considered that? So I think, I do really honestly think that evolutionarily speaking, that there was a lot of value in that hypervigilance. But, I just think now it's that hypervigilance has been just it's been appropriated for different purposes. There's a lot of different things that we have to be concerned about, but they're not, they don't necessarily have to do with direct survival, but we think of them as survival. It's like all or nothing. Like if I lose my job, I'm going to die. It's kind of like the saber-toothed tiger for today, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. I think we have lost perspective, and you're right. We take situations and we view them through the lens of life or death, when really, even the worst thing that can happen, your house burns down, you lose your job, you're not dead. And,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
you can still get everything you need, from nature, essentially. And that's one of the things I like about, I'm not sure if it's the Stoics or if it's the Taoists, but there's definitely a sentiment of, nature is providing you everything you need. You don't need anything else. You don't need all the money and this and that. You've got everything you need in nature, right?
Yeah, exactly. I would think that, a variety of different traditions might even think that way, but, and I think rightly so. I mean, there's something consistently going on historically with, say like the Taoist and the Stoics, and, a variety of these traditions are kind of, coming about at the same time. I think probably for good reason. I mean, I think life was kind of sort of maybe even borderline in terms of like, possibly, say like full civilization versus still aspects of it that were very much animal-like or something. Right. I don't know. But it just seems to me that these traditions start emerging at this time, and they're really about, how to deal with basically what you can't control, because obviously life is unpredictable. It's death, disease. At that point in time, there wasn't, as many, it just 1/15, say, of what we have today, maybe even less. They're, put in positions where, everything's going great, and then you get an abscess in your tooth, and then it goes to your roots, and then next thing I don't know, you're dying because of something like that.
Because of poor dental hygiene.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, now we just take that for granted. I mean, recently my oldest son had appendicitis. I mean, technically, he probably would have died if it wasn't for modern advances in science and technology and medicine. So, I mean, this was pretty commonplace. I mean, I think even like 100 years ago, it was common possibly to, I think it was fairly common for you to at least lose a child in the last couple 100 years. It wasn't that abnormal to, lose a kid or a mother in childbirth. It just, so I think, I just think we're in a different era, and I think all the craziness of information and all this is just it's taking certain things about us and sort of applying them in different ways that I think really exacerbate, what are probably natural things that have just gotten really, I think, out of control. So
they're definitely natural responses. I mean, they have to be, because we're creatures of nature, and there are responses. So, but you're right. I mean, it's like, we have it better than any generation before us, and yet we're still like, it's like the level of anxiety from somebody 2,000 years ago who could have died at any moment from an, like you said, an infected tooth, to today, where we have no worries as far as our health, or very few worries as far as our health go, but we're still anxious in the same like level of anxiety as we were 2,000 years ago, but we have it way better. It just seems so strange to me that we haven't sort of ramped it down a bit over the years and gone, yeah, you know what, things are pretty good right now, it's time to relax.
Right, yeah, exactly. I haven't necessarily put my finger on that, but it does appear to be that. And I think, some of the practices that I've learned have just kind of, it helps me essentially understand that, there's an aspect of us that I don't think a lot of us understand that is natural. And I would say, namely, just peace. I think that, when you look at like our cousins, and primates, things like that, I just, yeah, they forage, they have their, as we say, they basically are eating, sleeping, and screwing and foraging, basically, right? I mean, I guess when I see or observe, other primates, there's an aspect of it that's just, hey, I gotta be free from predators. I've got to make sure that, I'm eating and my kids are eating. But they seem to know downtime. They really seem to appear to, relax. They understand, there's time for different things, and it just seems in our culture, people don't understand how to relax. It doesn't seem to be second nature in our culture to value, slowing down or relaxing or finding peace in the day. I mean, that's just not how our culture is structured. So I think that's an unfortunate, an unfortunate byproduct of, either consumerism, capitalism, et cetera. It might even be inevitable. I don't know. But
I think to some extent with the cognitive capabilities that we have compared to our, our closest relatives in the primate family, I think it definitely makes sense, because what you're saying is spot on. Like they do what they got to do, and then they play, right? But then if a predator shows up, they get hypervigilant, they get aggressive. As soon as the predator's taken care of, they're back down to a normal level of vigilance and awareness. Whereas we, with our thoughts, we keep that hypervigilance alive. They don't have that same sort of capacity for symbolic languages. So they can't keep thinking about like, oh man, what if another predator shows up? We just took care of this one, but what if a bigger one shows up? Oh my God, what if it kills my family? They can't do that, right? So they de-escalate. After the problem is solved, they de-escalate and they're back to normal. Whereas we keep it going with our fucking minds. We just keep it blah, 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 right? And we just make ourselves aggressive and anxious. And so to me, it's, and culture obviously is a byproduct of this sort of higher functioning cognitive capability that we have. So it makes sense, right? I mean,
well, yeah, I would think that if you can portend the future and, and it does appear to be like linguistic in nature. So that actually explains a lot to me in terms of, why some of these traditions seek to essentially, minimize or, allow a reprieve from like all that linguistic stuff, because you're rattling off in your head, I mean, these concepts and ideas, but they're not, I don't know, they are very much language based. They're essentially propositions about the future, so I think they probably occur in the head linguistically, and then you sort of evaluate them, or you don't. They just get ahead of you, and that's what causes the panic response. I mean, you're essentially pulling on, the trigger, in your amygdala, basically, is what's happening.
Yeah, your thinking is triggering the amygdala over and over again, basically. You're creating fear responses in yourself or anger responses in yourself just by forming words in your head and listening to them.
Yeah, exactly. So, right, I definitely would say that there, from experience now, there just seems to be, okay, well, if that's the case, then how do you either A, surpass language, or B, how can you reason with yourself in that regard? Like, in other words, certain propositions are introduced, but a lot of times we don't really evaluate the truth of those, or, I think it's just essentially those thoughts get ahead of us and then emotions follow. And it doesn't seem anyone has really taught us, in any way, shape, or form in school, et cetera, where somebody says, hey, listen, sit down and, let's slow that thinking down, and we can evaluate, the truth of whether or not this proposition in your head is worth pursuing or not, or even reacting to.
Yeah, and that's basically what Stoic philosophy and CBT is all about, right? I mean, engaging in metacognition, thinking about your thinking, which is, a bit of a mindfuck in itself, but considering what your thoughts are telling you, like, so you're splitting yourself off into two almost, and you're looking at yourself from an outsider's perspective and going, am I right on this, or am I just blowing it out of proportion?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what helps me is just to kind of, view that sort of as like a two-tiered, situation. Like, I guess architecturally in my head, I think of it as like, top tier is basically reason, which is sort of your guiding principle. And then beneath that might be your emotional reasoning. So, it appears, yeah, I don't know which comes first. I mean, I've heard it argued a number of different ways. I don't even think it really matters. I just think that there's sort of this close knit tie between what you think and how you feel, and how you feel is how you think. So I think that the way you described it makes a lot of sense. To me it's just essentially it's like thoughts come in. You evaluate those thoughts based on sort of a cold reasoning. It's sort of like how you would outside of your own thinking. Because if a salesperson came to the door and said, "Hey, I've got this washing machine that vacuums too," I mean, your immediate response is going to be, "Hey, wait a second, that doesn't even make sense." So the rational thinking is always a lot more critical, right? Emotionally, you might say, "Oh, okay, well, that's awesome. Let me buy that, because if it can do that, that's fantastic." But I think most of us are skeptics outside of our own thinking, if that makes sense. In other words, we're skeptical towards a lot of what other people say, or various things that are claimed, but rarely do we turn it in on our own thinking and emotions. And I think that was a sort of a eureka moment for me. I was like, oh, wait a second, I'm like so hyper skeptical about everything except my own thinking.
And that's the first thing you should be skeptical about, right?
Right, exactly. So it was just an opportunity where you just said, okay, well, I just if you can slow it down and you evaluate it, you just go, okay, here's a proposition, just like as if somebody walked up to you and said, here's my claim. All right, so my head just made a claim, and I'm going to evaluate it and weigh it based on reason. And 9 times out of 10, you're able to identify, like, well, that's fallacious, that's just erroneous, and it's an exaggeration. So let's reframe it, let's correct it. So yeah, I think I've learned a lot of this from cognitive behavioral therapy, which really seemed to be like one of the only modalities, psychotherapeutically speaking, that had like a real immediate impact on the way that I thought. I had read a book called Feeling Good by David Burns, and the whole book is basically chock full of these types of examples. He uses all these various case studies of the way in which people saw things, and then essentially help them filter it through like basically cold reason. And once I saw that, I was like, wow, that's just revolutionary to my way of thinking. So I did not. By the way, I did not understand that CBT was even based on Stoicism. I came across those two things completely independently of each other. By the way,
Oh, really?
I happened to come across a small little book, and I don't even know where I got it. I think I thumbed through it in the philosophy section, and I think the first thing that I read, it was that Sharon Labelle translation of Epictetus.
Yep.
Yeah, I remember just the way that it came across was just like, wow, this is profound. And the thing is it appealed to me immediately because it was in the philosophy section. So anyway.
Yeah, that's interesting because, yeah, I mean, I had never heard of CBT, and eventually, I got into Stoic philosophy, and then eventually I learned about CBT through that, and I started telling people, like, when my sister-in-law is a psych nurse,
Yeah.
So I asked her, I'm like, have you ever heard of CBT? And then, every time I'd ask somebody, they'd be like, yeah, that's like the most common or the most popular form of therapy right now. And so I had no idea. I was just like, so it really, for me, it was like that sort of, I didn't need validation for Stoic philosophy because after, like you, my first sort of encounter with it, it made an immediate impact on me. I knew instantly that there was something here that was definitely worth learning about and embodying. But then the fact that, there's a school of therapy that's based on this philosophy and that is also, by consensus known as the most sort of effective form of therapy, just made it all the better for me.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think, I know of a variety of different, like, psychotherapeutic modalities, and I've actually, I've had therapy on a couple different occasions, and the ones that really seem to really make sort of a, I would say I made a big impact. I didn't know what to do thereafter. It was just sort of, I had the experience, and then other things in life just got in the way of following through on it. But yeah, cognitive behavioral therapy, just it was the one that just seemed to kind of arrest me for a moment, to stop me to like really think about how my thinking is. So yeah, it changed the relationship essentially, to the way in which I think, and that was a profound way at things. And I remember in Sharon LaBelle's translation of Epictetus, I just remember, it was weird. I think I remember something that stood out to me. It had to do with basically, if you should essentially look at your own child's death similar to how you would your neighbor's child's death. And that like really resonated, because it was kind of like, wait, what? How does that? Okay, so what that means to me basically is, it is sad that my neighbor's child has died. Okay, but there is sort of a refrain from all that, because there's some distance, because death happens. But we don't necessarily think of it like that when it's our own child. We seem to want to go far beyond just that immediate sort of reality. Like we don't necessarily accept the reality when it comes to our own lives and our own children. So it was sort of this twist of thinking that, again, I don't know that anyone can ever think this way. It seems to me like, wow, this is a really interesting way of looking at life, because if we just divide things into their factual parts, that can make a big difference in how we feel and how we think.
Yeah, without basically adding anything extra to the situation or to the reality, right? I mean, because that's where a
Right.
lot of the problems come in, is when we, like your child dies. That's obviously, you're gonna be sad that your child died, but then to say that's a tragedy, it's an injustice. I was a bad father. I should have done more of this when he was alive. Those are all sort of extra layers on top of that one fact, which is that your
It's
child just passed away.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
And we do that without thinking. I mean, we do it unconsciously, and we just engage with it, like you said. It just kind of happens, and we don't get ahead. It gets ahead of us, and we just get dragged by it. Whereas if we were ahead of it, we could stop it, and we might have a chance at
Well,
slowing it down at least.
yeah, exactly. And I would, to tie it back to just my own anxiety disorder, panic disorder. What's fascinating about that is, there's two prongs to this problem. There's that which I can't control, but there's this other facet that I can control. So what I can't control is managed by medication. What I can control, the things we're talking about, which, anxiety for me just essentially got so far beyond, and, not even manageable. I was literally having panic attacks, like back to back, multiple times a day. I couldn't stop
Wow.
this misfiring. It was horrible. I wasn't sleeping. This went on really pronounced for about a year, without medication, without any cognitive behavioral therapy. I mean, this is when I knew that there was something profoundly, wrong and, challenging. So, so you had asked earlier, when did I notice this? I noticed it very early on. It became much more pronounced when I got involved, in a Bible-based cult. So, that in and of itself really exacerbated this problem in a myriad ways. I mean, it was, profoundly, challenged because of that experience, I think.
Well, and from previous conversations we had, you said there was almost like a culture of, for lack of better words, snitching in your cult, and so
Yeah.
that would obviously make you a lot more anxious and distrusting of others. And you were saying, you were always worried about people plotting against you, or just plotting in general, nefarious plots. In an environment like that, those types of anxieties just get fanned into a huge bonfire.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it was even more existential than that. I mean, so there was that aspect where, you were sort of in a culture where, it was almost like you had to get permission to date certain people, to marry certain people. The group, I mean, so it wasn't like, like a Heaven's Gate kind of situation. I mean, it was more, just take like a Calvary Chapel mainstream sort of Christianity, and then you add sort of a church government to it, which is structured hierarchically, where literally every person has a discipler or has somebody that essentially is sort of their spiritual mentor. Wow. So it's not like one guru, it's like thousands of gurus in like this hierarchical structure going upwards to like one guy who leads the whole church. So why that causes a lot of problems is just simply because people lorded it over other people. I mean, they exercised, essentially abusive powers that no person should, have. Let alone, let's say even like you've got like your, evangelists and say a couple elders, and their role has some functional power. I mean, basically it was a divestiture of power across the entire platform in a way that, really caused people to puff up with pride. I mean, made them hyper, power hungry. I mean, it was a really strange environment because, there was something clearly wrong about it. It bothered me, but it met my emotional needs in such a way that it kept me very glued to it. Not only that, then it became more of a fear-based circumstance. So again, you have to understand the whole program, the whole platform, etc. Really about, using fear in ways in which, can control people. So some of the problem. I mean, surely that's a kind of a marriage made in heaven. I mean, it's really scary how those two things came together, because I felt like if I critically thought of this situation, that it basically meant hell. And I just had this sort of all or nothing sort of true believer attitude about it. And it was ripe for all kinds of problems. And so surely when I first I'll tell you, the day that I got baptized, I had a massive panic attack, because I just wasn't sure if I was getting myself into something, right or wrong, and, my panic attack probably was informing me well, but, then the rest is history.
Yeah, well, and I mean, the path that you took to get here is the path that you took, and you wouldn't be who you are now if you hadn't gone through those experiences. So, as horrible as they were at the time, I think in hindsight, you're not going to get fooled again by any kind of cult or any kind of whatever anything, right? You're not going to be buying into Amway or Epicure
exactly.
or anything.
If you think that my hypervigilance has turned into I'm so hyper skeptical about everything because I've been hurt by those kinds of circumstances that it's hard for me to watch TV without reading the fine print and getting pissed off.
Right.
Because it's just essentially every which way you turn now, it's like someone wants to fuck me over, somebody wants to hurt me, somebody's looking to take control of me, those kinds of things. And so you have, after I've been hurt by that, I think that there's a natural sort of fear, to be, involved in anything like that. And unfortunately, it's not just churches, it's corporations, mm-hmm. It's, advertising, it's a whole, plethora of things that, it's politics. These things really do exacerbate a lot of anxiety and fear. So I've got to be very mindful of what I, expose myself to.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to circle back, you made up a good point of corporations are sort of lumped into the same group. You were talking about abuses of power, and the first thing that came to mind was like, the power-hungry, power-tripping boss who just makes your life a living hell. Now what you went through was way worse than that, because instead of a boss, this was somebody who, at least at the time, you believed was responsible for your spiritual salvation. So, your boss might be able to make your 9 to 5 a living hell. You might even force you to quit, but then you just find another job. When you think that your entire soul's salvation depends on it, I can't even imagine the anxiety, man.
Well, yeah, I mean, you said it well, because, I mean, that, incidentally, this church actually met with, like, Fortune 500, types of either motivational type, what are they called? Consultants. These are, I mean, the reason, the irony of all this is that the church was ran just like a corporation. So, I mean, that the whole structure, the whole entirety of it really did run off it. And the reason being is because the church was very hyper focused on evangelizing the world in a single generation. I mean, they literally believed like we are going to evangelize the entire world within 32 years. So, there was, that we would meet, in groups and talk about how many people. It would be like a sales meeting is what it really was, with a little Jesus garb on it, so. But anyways, I mean, again, what I will say, and this might be an interesting segue, is, I will say that the one thing about that group is it was really, really adamantly about practice, meaning Christianity is not necessarily about doctrines and, theology and politics and anything like that. It was more, living it out, living out Christianity the way the Bible actually tells you to live it out. So I will say, to their benefit, I mean, people were pretty radical about really putting into practice what it is that the Bible taught. So, in terms of, being, an upright person, or being a moral person, a virtuous person, those kinds of things. I mean, that was a phenomenal aspect of the group. So it taught me, essentially, that there's lots of people who claim, this, that, or the other, but it's very few that actually put things into practice. So practice is kind of what led me to, many years later, to Stoicism, Zen Buddhism, Epicureanism, the Taoism. These are practices. I mean, these are not, there's an element of them that might have, I think they teeter things regarding worldview, but it's more about self-improvement. It's more about essentially putting into practice these things, that can be life-changing, that really don't have a lot to do with like metaphysics. So I think generally there's lots of philosophies, and there's lots of different positions, religions, etc. They want to deal with and answer questions about metaphysics, about, essentially it's a worldview. Mm-hmm. I really don't think of like, essentially Zen, Taoism, Epicureanism, or Stoicism that much as a worldview. We can argue that. I mean, I think you could make a case, but I feel very strongly that a person like myself can derive from that a philosophy of tranquility. And I think that's where all those particular practices and perspectives are, you're able to derive out of them a psychotherapy, basically what would be called as a philosophy of living.
Yeah, a philosophy of living, absolutely. Yeah, I agree. And it's funny that you say that, the practicing aspect of it, because I know a lot of, I call them hypocristians, right? Sunday Christians, right? And then they're smoking, drinking, and fornicating the rest of the week. And that's fine. I'm all for drinking, smoking, and fornicating, but don't pretend that you're something and then do that. You know what I mean? So the fact that they would actually try at least to adhere to the principles as they interpreted them, because again, there's thousands of different Christian sects that interpret it slightly differently, but the fact that they tried to stick to what they believed the Bible told them is admirable. I don't think that's weird of you to say at all. I think you might not agree with the principles, but at least you can admire the fact that they stuck to them.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, sorry, I was just checking my phone because it looks like it was like 10%. You'll have to cut this out. Well, I think that it's important to even say, that so I should back up a little bit. I think there is great apprehension from people of my flock. And what I mean by my flock is, after Christianity, I basically just kind of went through I went through a variety of different ways of looking at things. So, from within Christianity, it became sort of like, here I am, and then it kind of moved into Unitarianism. And then once it was like Unitarianism, it kind of moved to deism. And so I've studied all the 18th century. And from that, I derived quite a deep appreciation for nature as a guide to morality. Essentially the metaphysics changing from, supernatural entities to, hey, I don't have a belief that there are supernatural entities. I believe that this is it. This is it. I mean, nature, whatever, nature being all that there is, all that we know is, so it's sort of it's a closed system in the sense that there's nothing outside of it. There's nothing supervening it. So, I went from one extreme to the other because frankly, I'm a person obviously of extremes, but, what I realized in all that is that, I really have a deeper reverence for things like conscience and, nature. And these were radical ideas in comparison to Christianity, which was, obviously much more about, having a relationship with a supernatural cosmic vending machine, to, believing that Jesus is your personal, friend or imaginary friend, that kind of stuff, And I don't say that rudely. I just say it that, that's how I really genuinely see it. So, I started to, I'm not sure how to explain this, but it's like once I gave up on those beliefs and lacked those kinds of beliefs regarding supernatural beings, etc., it just became like, well, this is all there is. This is one life to live, and that's it. And so that really transformed, a lot for me. And so I saw myself as a thoroughgoing naturalist, but in that naturalism, it was nothing more than like a metaphysical view. There was nothing really inherent that lended itself to, a way of living, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, totally. But I mean, like you said, though, it does, nature can teach you something about morality and the proper sort of constitution of a human being, how we evolved and what our sort of strengths are as a species. And so those things can kind of give you an idea of certain things that you can do in your life. But for the most part, you're right. It's just a way of a belief that makes sense of the universe. So for some people, it's like you need an invisible sky daddy to make sense of the universe. And for you and I, it's a closed system. So everything that it needs is in itself, and it can, it transforms itself, and it doesn't need any help from some, mythical being, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and I think that it was a slow, like, maturing process in terms of just sort of going, okay, these are things about Christianity I think made sense. These are things that make no sense at all. Here are these things about, having an atheistic perspective, lacking a belief in, God or gods, etc. And just, that there's no one doctrine, there's no one particular, religion that, is right. They just all seem to be wrong in many ways, and all seem to be right in a lot of ways too. So, the more I continued to study, the more I was just kind of broadening my perspective and just kind of looking at different things at, different, from different points of view. But I will say, in the 10 years that followed, being involved in this Bible-based cult, it was lonely and just sort of, very depressing and negative, and just, there were aspects of it that surely charmed me and, and enchanted me in terms of like, evolution and understanding the natural mechanisms, and how this diversification of, species occurs. Like I didn't want to know like God created them and poofed them into existence. I want to know the specific mechanisms. Like I want to lift up the hood of nature and look inside and understand the mechanisms going on. So that was thrilling, but I wouldn't say that there wasn't. I didn't feel from that what followed necessarily was how to live one's life or how to live the good life.
No.
That started to become more front and center, I'd say, maybe more so in the last 5 years. I haven't, so I read every book on atheism, every book on evolution, and, came up with basically like, okay, well, I don't know how this is going to define my life.
Yeah, it just tells you how all this scientific atheistic stuff that you studied, that you learned about, it was interesting, but it didn't really give you that sense of I don't know, what would you call it, sense of purpose or of how to live properly, sort of thing.
Yeah, I think I was just commenting on, like, some people basically might even think, like, well, and I've heard this before, it's just sort of like, well, then just live your life. You don't need, like, an ism, any sort of guidance and whatnot. So, yeah, I mean, I just think of it as, like, strange, just because it's not really anything more than just getting, advice or life advice, from a grandfather, or, but this grandfather might be Epictetus, a couple thousand years ago.
My ancient Chinese grandfather.
Yeah, exactly. So I kind of just look at it as, no, I think if you're just open, there are ways you can just define your own life. I mean, I think once I had left Christianity, I saw it as, hey, look, if there's no God, then basically I'm the author of my life. I'm the director of this movie, etc. So that doesn't, that's not like some arrogant statement. It just follows from the premise. It's just, it is what it is. And so there's something really liberating about that, and there's something nauseating about it.
Well, I mean, yeah. Now that you realize you're the author of your life, you need to learn grammar and syntax and style, and so all these things that were kind of taken care of for you previously, right? Because somebody else was guiding your steps in a sense.
Well, and for me, Christianity wasn't static at all. I think that's what made it different for me, and really I was fairly different than most people in the group. I mean, every day I was studying. Every day it wasn't just the Bible. I wanted to understand hermeneutics and apologetics and theology. I mean, so that became a portal to history. It became a portal to philosophy, ways of thinking. So it kind of at the end just turned back on itself. It's like, oh, well, thanks Christianity, through apologetics, I've learned how to defend the faith by use of reason and logic and philosophy. And then it's like, then it just at the last, towards the end, it just flip-flopped on itself, and it was like, all right, well, now I'm thinking clearly, this is nonsense. This can't be. I mean, this is horrifying. This is, every aspect of it just became just, again, I threw the baby out with the bathwater, and I had a lot of resentment, a lot of bitterness and hatred and anger towards a lot of this. So, slowly over time, it took a lot, after that hurt. And I mean, when we left the group, I mean, we were completely excommunicated and marked by the church to, in front of thousands of people to, have us be stayed away from. And there was a lot of, Carol, my wife, had, cried every single day for probably a year straight. I mean, it was a really, really emotionally challenging circumstance. So, nothing light about it at all. So, it's understandable how you would really have a hatred towards anything, after you've come out of it. So, that became just a very interesting time for me to feel free to just sort of explore, to explore my, my own thoughts and thinking, to what are some ways of looking at things differently, since I've looked at these in such a prescribed way.
And that led you down a bunch of, like you said, it was a gateway to history, into philosophy, into all these things that you may not have ever looked into if you had never been a Christian.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Well, yeah, I think so. Not at least not in this. I think the degree at which I looked at it, the lens was so hyper focused. I don't think I would have looked at it like that. I was much more artistic. I was very into drawing and thinking and poetry, and I wanted to be a filmmaker. And so that was the other side of, the other hemisphere of the brain. I mean, I really genuinely, it was much more like that prior to even getting involved in Christianity. It's sort of like the developmental process became more about, thinking in rational terms, and what logic is and why, it made sense. And so, yeah, I mean, I definitely learned a lot of philosophy and a lot of logic. And so, those things shaped me as well. So I've got like this weird sort of artistic side to me and this like really weird radical side to me. So,
well, it's finding the balance between the two, right? That's the big struggle I think that we all have is finding that balance.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, the artistic side, I just mean to, it's shorthand for a lot of things, whether it's creativity or, expressing yourself in illogical ways, so that made me a lot more open to understanding like religion is sort of a response to the transcendent. And, those are that it's almost as if that side of me kind of broke through in some ways, because it loosened this sort of tight hold that I had in defending Christianity, but enough logic to sort of say, what the hell am I defending?
Yeah, well, it's like they gave you the tools to defend Christianity, but then you use those tools against it inadvertently, right? It's like, wait a second, if I use these against what I believe, all of a sudden it comes apart.
Yeah, no, exactly. It's sort of like, that infamous sort of, the thread in the sweater. It's just, you just pull it, and I just kept pulling at it, and I'm like, I'm still pulling at it.
That's funny.
It never, so that's the, the peculiar part. So there was a book that kind of set me off in a certain direction, I think. I'm this hardcore like atheist / skeptic / evolutionist and arguing with people and what. I just, slowly and steadily, I just was kind of like, this seems really empty. I mean, I can't believe that my life is just essentially, basically defending or fighting. Now, I think that fight's necessary, and I think there's a variety of frontiers this matters, but I think for me, it just became like science. Oh, well, science essentially, it helps you it helps you understand again the way in which nature works. So the appreciation that I had, the reverence that I had towards nature became more, for lack of better terms, more spiritual. So, the way I understand spiritual is just sort of a reverent / awe, in response to, the way in which the universe is, unbelievably mysterious, and, the feelings that you can't really describe when things overtake you. So I started realizing that naturalism is spiritual. And I would, you might even call it pantheism. I definitely went through a phase. No, I wouldn't even call it a phase, actually. It just, again, I kind of see these things evolve over time, but meaning my points of view. But pantheism really, that's when things kind of connected in terms of like, nature is like God in that it's a horrible, like, mother. It's like the mother is abusive and doesn't care and it's indifferent. But then there's like an aspect of this mother that nurtures. She's essentially what gave us birth. We came out of nature, those kinds of things. So it was kind of like the first time I was able to situate something that actually made sense, where you could say, hey, this creator, nature itself, is indifferent and meaningless and doesn't care, and yet on the other hand, it's what's brought everything together that strikes awe in me and wonder, etc. So
as soon as you shed the invisible Sky Daddy costume, the truth behind that costume, in my opinion, is way more marvelous and is full of splendor. Nature, right? I mean, that's really the metaphor is just based on that, in my opinion. There's whether it's Zeus or whether it's, Yahweh or Baal or whoever, they embodied certain aspects of nature. And so our primitive ancestors were like sort of dividing nature into these personalities, right? But really, the monotheistic God is all of those personalities combined. So yeah, sometimes he's nice, sometimes he's butchering 100,000 Canaanites. It doesn't have to make sense because nature doesn't make sense. Sometimes she's good, like you said, and other times she's a cruel mother. So.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of the hardest parts that I think that I could not resolve or rectify. In a theology like Christianity, you can only extend the problem of suffering to, you can only like solve it in very, very weak and unsatisfying ways. I mean, there's no problem of evil when you just accept nature for what it is. I mean, there's it's not a problem in terms of having to solve it. It just is. There's just no other. There's nothing further to figure out. And there's a lot of peace that comes as a result of that. It's just I don't like it. I don't like the fact that we have to arise and die. I can't say that I emotionally enjoy that or even like that. It's just a fact. It's just the way that it is. And so you have to orientate yourself around that fact, not the other way around. I think that's what's so funny about religion to me compared to this point of view. It's like I can't situate myself. I have to do the situating. The way I think religion can be is like you want it to be what you want. You want it to control the decisions of other people through prayer. You want God to intervene, so that I can get this job as opposed to some other schmuck who, he's praying the same prayer, and those are just totally irresolvable like conflicts, like intellectually that doesn't make sense. There's nothing to figure out for me in this point of view. It's a thoroughgoing naturalism where it's like I really feel like reverent awe, and I'm some of the practices like mindfulness, for example, is just an outcrop of thoroughgoing naturalism to me, because when I'm embracing, nature for what it is by not thinking about it or worrying about it, etc., but just engaging it and just being aware of it and paying attention to it, to me, that's just I can't even begin to tell you how satisfying that is in comparison to petitioning a God who never responds, who never manifests.
Yeah, or who you can't verify his responses anyways, because maybe he is responding, but how would you know, you puny mortal?
Exactly.
You know what I mean? Like, you prayed for this and he gave you the opposite. Well, maybe that's what you needed. How do you know?
Right. So it's going to pantheism, for example. This idea that nature is God and God is nature is just unbelievably satisfying to me in every way. The reason is that when I'm looking, when my hands go through the blades of grass, it's as if I'm petting God. Right?
Yeah, well, you are God in a sense as well, right? I mean, that's the other sort of step in pantheism is you're a product of nature. You're in nature. Nature is God. Then you're it. There's nothing else, right?
And again, I take that for myself as just authoring my life, and it's just. It to me is just it's a very satisfying way of looking at things. I didn't think naturalism could be something more than just sort of a quick metaphysical dismissal of supernaturalism. No, naturalism can be just far more robust. It can include this is again where I think Taoism and Zen is really useful towards that end. It really connects you in a way that I don't think a metaphysical way of looking at things is going to, accomplish. So again, I can see nature as all there is. Okay, great, but nothing follows from that necessarily for me. Some people need to be introduced more intimately with nature through these kinds of practices. Mm-hmm. So for a person like me who's lost in thought, the mental chatter, all the worries and the incessant like panic attacks, etc., that doesn't connect you in any meaningful way with the tree that's right outside your window, right? So it's because your mental life is overtaken all things. And so, these disciplines allow you to connect in a way that I don't think you could ever connect, because there's a huge chasm between recognizing and paying attention to that tree and you worrying about 10 things that are going to happen next week. It totally just prevents you from seeing exactly what should be appreciated.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. You're totally right. And it's less about making a connection and more about finding the connection. And I think you're right. Your thinking and your mind chatter kind of obscures the connection that's already there. I mean, the tree's there whether you're thinking about next payday or not. But when you shut that down and you stop the thinking and the chatter and you actually become mindful, the tree changes in a sense. You know what I mean? It doesn't change, but you're experiencing it. It changes in a totally different way. You become more aware of it. You start to see all the intricate ways that the branches are weaving together and the way the sunlight is filtering through them and the leaves are rustling lightly in the breeze. And you just get this feeling of like, that's what religious people feel, right? I mean, I don't know. I've never been religious, but that's what I imagine religious people feel when they start to think about God and pray and stuff. Like, I feel that. I feel that when I am mindful and I'm in nature, 100%, dude. So I totally get where you're coming from.
Yeah, that's a great way of expressing it. And that is exactly how I feel. And I think the reason that I continue to, the reason that it continues to prompt like a natural desire to keep doing it, and it's just simply based on just feeling a sense of unification. I guess some people refer to it as oneness, or I'm not sure how to say it other than it. There have to be some clear, obvious biological reasons why we feel such amazing connection. I don't even know if it's just simply a mechanism of reflection. I'm not sure. I almost wonder if other species feel the same kind of connection, or if it's just so second nature to them. I'm not really sure how to think about it. It just seems to me like, some have said, for example, that there's some connection we have, to the ocean because, we're made up of like 98% salt or something like that. Yeah. I don't know. There has to be some, one thing that I had heard, and again, I'm just, picking this out of nowhere, but this idea that we feel fantastic in nature because it's not just the essential oils that are coming off the terpenes, etc., coming off of the foliage, but there's certain healthy bacteria that we're ingesting too by way of breathing it in. Mm-hmm. So I mean, again, it's not just some ethereal feeling. There's just some clear, obvious reasons why it connects us in biological terms, I think.
Yeah, I think there definitely has to be some physical aspect to that whole feeling of awe in our relationship with nature and stuff like that. I mean, just the fact that we spent 200 or let's say 190,000 of our years as a species in nature, right, walking barefoot in the on the savannah and the ground. And so I mean, when we return to nature now after being locked up in an office building breathing recycled air for the last 8 hours, when you walk out into nature and you aren't thinking about your petty problems and you're actually mindful, then yeah, of course all of that comes rushing back. It's like we were talking about how phobias are transmitted hereditarily. Well, I think our appreciation for nature is probably something like that as well.
Yeah, I most definitely think so. And there seems to be some telltale signs as to why that's the case. So totally, I love and appreciate that a lot.
Yeah, there's something like it took me, I think that the first time I ever felt spiritual about anything was with nature, and it was thanks to Neil deGrasse Tyson, man. Cosmos.
Oh, yeah.
I watched the
Yep.
reboot of that season, and I started feeling things that I never felt in my life. And like I said, these are the feelings that religious and spiritual people get. So I guess now it makes me religious, or spiritual, should I say? But watching that show, man, it was more than just like the trip of understanding things that I'd never understood before. It was more than that. It was definitely that awe and that wonder, right? So I mean, yeah, the universe is a trip. It's such a crazy place, and we're part of it, and we were born in it. And
I mean, yeah, I was going to say, there's definitely hints of that, even preceding Neil deGrasse Tyson. So if you want to just kind of think of like sort of the atheistic sort of slash skeptic, community, it's just the four horsemen, coming down, ripping people's heads off, Dawkins, Hitchens, Sam Harris, etc. So there was a need for that. And I think that was fantastic. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Certain people needed to be emancipated. But I think that, a healthy way or a healthier way of, rounding that out is just, like people like Carl Sagan, for example. I mean, he just had such a reverence that it's almost as if he spoke spiritually, even though he was, a non-believer, So I think people started to feel like, hey, it doesn't have to be this all or nothing feeling or this all or nothing approach. It can be really meaningful, and we can find, good things in Christianity. We can, deduce certain aspects of the Quran that are beautiful. It doesn't have to just be this all or nothing thing. And I think that's where I've changed most. I would just say that I have a very secular approach to these different practices and different, philosophies. I'm not really, like I said, I really don't care what Stoicism says about Zeus or, Taoism about the Tao. Those are like sort of second place and really sort of irrelevant to me. What I get so excited about sharing is just I'm so essentially grateful that in each of those traditions there really is. I would just say anxiety is being addressed because it's a significant problem. If it's not, like mine's an exaggerated issue, but surely everybody struggles with this enough that these traditions are talking about it. So that's pretty amazing to me because they're not really talking so much about whether the universe is finite or infinite, etc. Most of them are just like, who gives a shit? There's just no answer. It's like an interminable sort of approach to asking questions. I'm reminded of, say, for example, the Buddha, who basically says, there's a shot, and the making of the wood, who the person is that crafted it, et cetera, and he's just not concerned about getting well. And so I'm in a position. So what I'm sharing is I'm in a position to get better. So that might not apply to everybody. I have lots of friends that think I'm strange. They just go, I don't understand why you have such a passion for these things. Well, I have a passion for getting well. So it's as simple as that. I want to get healthy and I want to be well. And maybe you don't have the same sort of problems or challenges that I do, but I'm using philosophy in a way that I never understood philosophy.
Yeah, I'm with you there, man. I thought philosophy was such a waste of time when I was in college, and basically all up until I stumbled onto Marcus. I mean, it was just like, why would you bother asking questions that have no answers? It seems like a bit of a waste of time to me,
Well, yeah, exactly. And I would say just prior to me getting involved in that church, basically, I did stumble upon existentialism, and, at 18, not really, at least for me, I understood, some of it. It didn't really resonate. It did seem that there were aspects that did fully resonate that I think have influenced me to this day. But yeah, I just think by and large, the thing about philosophy when it comes to ancient philosophies, less to do about high-minded stuff and a lot more to do with, like, I would just call psychotherapeutics. I mean, really, it's when philosophy was a psychology. People talk about like psychology coming out of philosophy. I think that's wrong. I think that philosophy was psychology, and I think that's what people miss.
Well, and philosophy was science as well. I mean, to go back to Neil deGrasse Tyson, he's been on the record saying that, philosophy is useless. You don't need it anymore because we have science. And it's like, well, wait a second. Philosophy is the granddaddy of science, right? Science, the first philosophers were scientists, Pythagoras and, even Epicurean with his sort of theory of atoms. I mean, these guys were using their mind only to determine what the basic fundamental building blocks of the universe were, and they did so successfully with no instruments, with no technology. So to say that philosophy is useless because science, I think, is a huge mistake.
Yeah, and it just requires defining terms simply because when I think of philosophy, I think of my hopeless endeavor with like Immanuel Kant, for example.
Right.
Surely he has a lot of important things to say that have influenced, etc. I'm not dismissing any of that. I'm just saying you don't pick up Critique on Pure Reason to figure out how to live the best life.
That's right.
He's just not addressing any of that. And most of modern philosophy, there's definite philosophers who dance around this issue and may even encourage certain ways of looking at things, but not like the ancients and not like the Hellenistic philosophers. I mean, again, these were like schools of philosophy, much like churches. I mean, prior to this, there was places people would go to learn how to live their life. Okay, so that's essentially almost like schools of psychology. It's like going to the psychologist or the therapist because my brother, he won't stop being angry with me. How do I deal with that? Or these are really practical things. My mother died or my child is missing, and these were significant realities for these people. They didn't have time to sit around and navel gaze as much as they could try to figure out how to live the good life, because that seemed to be what was obvious and what was necessary.
And that's what's lacking today in our education system as well, I think, because we're teaching people what to think. We're teaching them to memorize these formulas and these, we're giving them skills that they'll probably never use in their life, but no one's teaching them how to use the instrument that they've been given, this mind, right? And how to use it properly.
Right.
No one's teaching them to think about what it means to live a good life, because I think everybody should define that on their own, or what it means to be a good person. Again, something that each of us has to sort of determine the type of person that we want to be. But that's never brought up in school. It's never brought up in the household, really. At least it wasn't in my family. And so I wish there were these schools still around, and it would be so awesome to be able to send your kid, 2 days a week to the painted porch or wherever, and to learn how to think properly and to learn how to use the mind. I mean,
right? There are some small incremental, things where some schools are adopting mindfulness practices and teaching kids to, basically sit down for a little while and to really reflect and to, essentially just be aware of their surroundings with their eyes closed. Those are awesome to see, moving forward. But yeah, I would just say by and large, that's just, it's not only that, it's not even practical knowledge. There's no auto shop anymore. There's no checkbook balancing, or finance class. These are the things that matter. I mean, again, I think education could be augmented in a very meaningful way with, these kinds of practices.
Totally agree, man. So Eric, I got to get going.
Yep.
And
right.
But before I do you have a line or a quote or anything that has had an impact on you or that's helped you change the way that you think or look at things that you'd like to share before we go?
Off the top of my head, I could just, the first thing that comes to mind, and again, this applies to people who have anxiety problems. It's understanding what's in your control and what's not, and a whole entire philosophy comes out of that.
Yeah, the dichotomy, right?
Yep.
Yeah, some things are in your power and some things aren't. So learn to deal with the ones that you can, and the ones that you don't, just forget about them.
Exactly.
Yeah. Brilliant. All right, well, thanks a lot, Eric. We'll do it again for sure. And